Welcome. Emotions are everywhere. So how can we be smarter with our feelings? The answer is emotional intelligence, or EQ. We're delighted you're watching, because at 6 seconds, we're working towards 1 billion people practicing the skills of emotional intelligence. Can we count you in? Here on 6 Seconds channel, you'll find practical skills for work and life, inspiration for today, and support to build a better future for all.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce today's live stream show. It's going to be about the special ingredients that makes coaching conversation great. And we're going to talk about this, the topic of coaching with a great set of panelists that I'm really excited to hear from. Some of them you've seen in other live streams, like Jenny Rogers. And you probably read her book, and some of the other ones you don't know yet, but you'll love as soon as you hear from them in a little bit. I'm excited to hear about them, and I want to introduce Joshua Freedman, our CEO and the host of today's live stream.
Thanks, Tom. Well, at 6 seconds, we have a mantra that we say, which is emotions drive people, and people drive performance. And yet, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with emotions. It's a term. I remember one time in one of our large projects with a military organization, they said, we love this content, but could we call it something other than emotional intelligence? Because, you know, that word, it's a little soft. Somehow we have interesting challenges with emotions, and this happens all over the world. I was very far away from here teaching a coaching training, and one of the participants had come through a different coaching school where they had been told, don't talk about emotions. And if the client expresses any, quote, negative emotion, you can't talk about it. You have to immediately ask them what's positive about that. So we have some interesting ideas out there in the world about emotions. And yet any of us who've dug into coaching know that we have lots of emotions as coaches. And maybe our clients' emotions are actually part of what makes coaching transformational. So today we have a panel where we get to talk about these intriguing questions about emotions and coaching and that secret ingredient that makes coaching conversations very powerful. So we'll bring in our panelists, and I also want to just give a shout out to all of you who are signing in from all over the world. I see we have people from the US and Maryland. It's great to see you here. And Germany and Austria and Pretoria and Bahrain. So we have a really global group today. Hello, Robin and LAPD. And I see some people here who are in coach training right now. So perfect. I'm not going to say hello to everyone because there are a lot of you signing on. But it's wonderful to get such a global group of people here together. And we have a global panel here together. So I'm going to ask each of you panelists to introduce yourselves and to tell us, what is a metaphor for you that represents the idea of emotion? What is a metaphor for emotion? Who's ready to go first?
I'll jump in. We'll just go alphabetical. How about that? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Ann Rindone, and I'm the Vice President of the Professional Coaches Organization with the International Coaching Federation. And as I was reflecting on this, I noticed all of the really powerful metaphors that describe emotions. We bury them, and we're bursting with joy, and we get fired up. But all of that seemed negative to me, and where I landed was that emotions are like a very delicate seed pod that you have to hold very carefully in your hands so as not to crush it.
Thank you. Jenny, how about you?
Yeah, okay. Well, my name's Jenny Rogers, and I've been a coach for about 30 years. And I started coaching at a time when there wasn't any coach training. And when slowly a few books began to be produced about how to be a coach, just as you said, Josh, there was very many of these writers said, oh, no, 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 if it's just something about emotion, that must be therapy. It's nothing to do with coaching. Now, fortunately, I'd started doing coaching before I'd really ever heard any of that stuff. So I'd already started dealing with the emotion that clients brought, because, of course, they brought them all the time. Thinking about the metaphor, my first idea was that emotions are a mainspring. And then I thought, oh, gosh, no, that's far too 20th century and mechanical. And I thought instead, I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but the coaching emotions. Emotion is the motherboard, really. It's the thing everything else joins into. And the brain can't work without emotion. We know that the limbic system of the brain is easily its most powerful part. So I think you have to embrace emotion in coaching your own and the clients.
I just want to share a couple people from the chat. Rania, thank you. There's definitely energy in emotions. And we actually know that neurobiologically, that literally emotions are chemicals that carry energy and information. And Jenny, the ocean and the waves, apt from somebody near the ocean. And there's, again, that energy, but change. And Natalie, what's your metaphor?
So I am now in France, but I am the R&D for China, for the China region in 6 seconds, and I've been a coach for only 5 years. I still feel I'm a new coach, but I'm doing emotional intelligence for many years. So I think I ask myself this question very often, because I like metaphors a lot. I think for me in the past, it was emotions were a bit like the weather. It's like unpredictable and very big, and when it rains, it rains. I still feel emotions very strongly. Also, being Argentinian, we express emotions a lot. But since I became a coach, emotions are also mirrors and windows. So it sometimes like that mirror window where it looks like a mirror, but when you look closely, you actually realize it's a window. So you can see your own reflection, learn more about yourself, about what's going on around you. And sometimes if you open that window, there's going to be a new landscape to look at. So I like to look at mirrors and windows as my emotions.
We have a coaching technique we use in our training called being an emotion detective. And one of the things that I have found as a coach and training coaches is that I often don't know what's really going on for a client. And if I get caught up in the story that they're telling, I lose what really matters. But when I hear an emotional clue, a little disconnect, or them saying, but really that's fine, and then my ears just perk up. And I go, aha, there's now I know what we're talking about. And I feel like somehow that tuning into that has been a big journey for me personally. So I'm not quite sure what the metaphor is of that. Maybe it's, again, to join Jenny in the old, the previous century, maybe it's like telegraph messages or something. But there's somehow for me a metaphor of signals of direction finding. In one of our coaches in our network named Salafa Batterjee, in one of our recent panels, talked about that emotions are kind of guides along the path. So maybe I'll steal her metaphor. Well, I just shared a little bit of something I've learned about emotions from the process of coaching. And I'm wondering if anyone else has learned something for yourself as you've been coaching. What have you learned about emotions and your own emotions? easy question. Jenny, let's start with you.
Well, that's a mega question, Josh. I'm a bit stunned by it, to be honest. I think all good coaching starts with understanding yourself as a coach. Not the place. A lot of people, when we first train as coaches, we believe it's about understanding the client, but actually it's about understanding ourselves. So I think the process of being a coach has taught me quite a lot about myself, and I've become a much less critical, much less judgmental, a much more tolerant person. And that process of self-discovery isn't finished. I learn something new all the time. And I think you have to learn what your own emotions are. You have to learn how to regulate your own emotions before you can even begin to start the business of trying to understand what clients are telling you.
Yeah, that really brings up something for me about sometimes people ask me, especially when I'm with Natalie in China, and our trainee coaches tend to be very, like, they're trying to write down exactly what we say. And they'll say, why did you ask that question? And so often the answer is, I have no idea. I felt it.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a big lesson for me, is actually trusting more of my own. I don't love the word intuition. I think the word feeling is right for me. Trusting my own feeling that's giving me a little nudge saying, ask this. It's like this little whisper in my ear.
Yeah.
I think what this says to me, really, another main learning for me has been that coaching isn't something that the coach does to the client. It's all about the relationship, and all relationships are about emotion. So I suppose what I've learned to pay much, much more attention to is the nature of the relationship between me and the client. And to ask about it, to ask the client, how are we getting on, you and me? Because it's the relationship that's the kind of engine that will propel everything forward, really. And that's all about emotion. What I'm feeling about the client, what the client is feeling about me, which is the absolute opposite of the way a lot of coach training certainly used to be done. That it was all about techniques and exercises and things that the coach did to the client, which I think that is not my experience of what works. But I'd be interested to know what Natalie and Anne think about that.
The process that was interesting for me going through training was that you do have to break it all down within yourself before you can even start to begin to think about having that partnership with a client. And what I learned about myself, I always said, oh, I'm nothing if I'm not self-aware. Going through the process, I absolutely learned that I had a lot to learn in terms of self-awareness. So I recognized through my training, as well as through the years that I've been coaching, that I had started out all focused on everyone else and not focused on myself. So the metaphor of the garden, I was always in somebody else's garden. So I had to tend my own. And then when you figure out what grows in your garden, then you can start to look at others, but not necessarily get so deep into it that you forget your own. So you do have to break down, understand what is going on inside of you so that you can regulate that, so that you can be in that safe space with the client and focus on them, understanding yourself better.
Yeah, I was connecting to what you're saying, Jenny, about the relationship, really about the space we are creating in the coaching. And in that space, I am having my intuition or feelings, and the client is having theirs, and sometimes we're feeling the same thing. I remember sometimes feeling something in my body and thinking about how is that connecting to maybe what the client is feeling right now. So, and if the relationship is there and the trust is there, the feeling of connection is there, maybe my feelings are mirroring also what's going on with the client. And I really like what you were saying about not doing something to the client. In this space, it's really co-creating, it's between equals, we're partnering. And Marilyn, who I think is online and is my trainer for coaching, always says that we are the biggest tool for change. We are the biggest tool for coaching. And it's really about our own being and our relationship with our feelings. If I look at my own feelings as the weather or something I cannot control and something I cannot really predict, that's also the way I will deal with the client's feelings that are coming up or that are not coming up. But somehow, like as Josh, you were saying, is that you can feel there's something there. There's some kind of little elephant in the room. And you don't know yet how big it is, but somehow you can feel it. But if my own relationship with my own emotions is, let's just ignore that, let's just put that aside, then I cannot bring that in the coaching session because I'm not comfortable with my feelings neither. So I think there is really this relationship between how I connect to my own feelings will really impact how I can also relate to the feeling of the client.
I just wanted to bring in a couple of comments from the chat. Paul, I think this is profoundly important that I think almost all of us have grown up with this very judgmental voice inside our heads, and and this voice to not feel things, at least not certain things, and then we get into this place where it's incredibly hard to be curious. So just speaking for myself, I was afraid of feelings. I was afraid of my own emotions, and I was afraid of other people's emotions, and I didn't want to ask people how they were feeling because I wouldn't know what to do if they told me. So I had some learning to do.
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot about compassion for myself as well. I think the stories I was telling myself about me and key relationships in my life were making me very judgmental. And only when I started to be compassionate for myself and for the people I love the most in my life, I succeeded to also be more compassionate and more present with my clients. And getting out of that judgmental voice of you should be doing this, or how can't you see that? This is the answer. If you just listen, right?
I have that, my grandmother's voice in my head. I appreciate this this comment. I don't know, I'm pronounce your name wrong, but Fumileo, that there's this rooting in respect. And Jenny, what do you think about this challenge? I mean, especially in these days where so many of us are just bombarded with a lot. Where's the balance point with being overwhelmed with feelings?
Between, I missed the last part of your sentence, Josh, between the balance between
connecting with feelings and being overwhelmed with feelings.
Oh, right, okay. Well, I was struck by something you said just now, Josh, about your early fear of feelings in coaching. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of coaches worry about. If I ask clients how they feel, they might tell me. And then what do I do? I need to do something. And I think one of the things you have to learn as a coach is that if a client is expressing very strong emotion to you, in the kind of, in quotes, normal world, people rush in, as we all know, with cliches and they're there, and or platitudes, don't worry, time will heal, and all that other stuff, because other people's anxiety, and I think this is probably the heart of your question, can transfer itself so easily to us. And then we get that feeling of helplessness. Oh, crumbs, I know this person is so upset, I need to do something. And I think that one of the biggest things I've learned as a coach is probably really maybe only in the last 10 years or so, is I don't need to do anything. If the client is expressing strong emotion, they're not most of the time asking me for a solution. They're not asking me for my wisdom or for me to pat them on the shoulder and say they're there, or to try to make it better, or to give them one of my little lectures about whatever. They really just want somebody to listen. And I was working with a client who'd been through an extremely distressing experience with a husband who'd been coercive and controlling, really very and violent. And she'd finally sort of managed to get him out of her life. And she came to me. I didn't really know her very well. I'd only met her once, and I had just had a single session with her. And at the end of it, she said, the thing I wanted was to tell my story, because everybody, my parents, my friends, my boss, my doctor, my solicitor, everybody has been they're either sorry for me or they've been telling me what to do. And all I wanted really was just for somebody let me just tell my story uninterrupted, and then ask me, and now what? In effect, that was my only question. She then reeled off all the things she was going to do. She took maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes, uninterrupted by me, just tell me, well, I'm going to finalize the divorce. I'm going to change my name. I'm changing my phone number. I'm going to retrieve my children's passports. I'm going to sort out my life. I'm going to tell the solicitor to press the button on the divorce, etc. She just reeled it all off. And I'd virtually done nothing. Probably, if you've been a fly on the wall, you would have heard me ask maybe 8 questions in 2 hours, that's all. That's all she wanted.
And Jenny, I know you're working on 2 new books, but one of them is about stories.
Yes.
And it seems like the story of good coaching involves relatively little plot.
Well, it involves a lot of, as it does for all of us, to do this well, it involves a lot of self-control and a lot of awareness. There's that feeling at the beginning when she started, this client started telling her story. I did find it appalling that she'd been through so much. And I began to hear, we've all talked about judgmental, I have that little judgmental voice saying, how come she let this happen? Mm-hmm. Couldn't she see what this guy was doing to her? Then she told me a little bit more about a very tragic family background. I began to understand why this man had so ruthlessly targeted her as vulnerable. But throughout that, maybe she was talking almost uninterruptedly for about an hour and 15 minutes. And all the time, I'm thinking, this is so awful. This is so horrible. And she cried a little bit, and I could feel tears prickling in my eyes. Although it's not going to be helpful there if I start crying too. So I think it's a continuous process of self-management and thinking, what do I need to do to be helpful here? What I need to do is just express rapport, express warmth by doing and saying nothing except listening properly. That's all. Yeah.
Nothing but listening properly, as if listening properly is something easy.
Well, it's not, because all that background rubbish is going on through your head all the time, because you are a fellow human and you're listening to her case, an absolutely tragic story. Yeah. Has a happy ending, by the way. She divorced him, she changed her name, she changed her phone number, she's changed her job. She's got him out of her life.
Yeah.
So what comes up for me in that is a bridge of courage. So how much courage did it take for her to come to you in the first place and then tell her story, and then the courage you as the coach needed to have to put aside your bias or your judgment and even recognize that holding back your tears was better for the client. So, Josh, I don't remember your exact question, but it feels like courage seems to be that commonality that we have with our clients a lot of the time.
Yeah, well,
not the same thing, but yeah.
I think that's a very interesting point. It did take courage. And I think the interesting thing was she didn't really know me at all. She'd met me once on a workshop, and she said to me when she called me, "You won't remember me." And I didn't. She'd been a very silent presence in that event, but she had cast me for that role. And for somebody who appeared to be without very much sense of agency, actually, she had a lot. She had chosen me as her listener.
It reminds me of that Araya Mountain Dreamer poem where she talks about will you stand in the fire with me?
Whoa, yeah.
And that, willingness to not, let me put it out, right? And let me make this into something else, but actually just be in the fire with somebody when
Yeah.
that's where they are.
And that means the courage of being vulnerable. And, what we talk about, fish don't talk about water, feeling uncomfortable with our feelings or with the client's feelings, and just staying in that fire a bit longer.
Natalie, can we draw on your linguistic, I can't keep track of how many languages you speak, but the word courage, tell us a little bit what that means to you.
Courage? In Chinese, there is the word qi in it, which is also the qi that we talk about, the qi, like energy. So it's interesting when we talk about courage, like we try to translate it into different languages. In Chinese, yong qi, the qi is actually the qi, like the energy. So the courage is something that for me feels like really like a little fire inside of me, like a little flame that I have inside of me that I need to take care of it once in a while. And that helps me to be able to move forward.
And in French, is it heart?
Courage. It's
Courage?
the same. You write it like in English, but you just say courage.
It sounds much cooler in French.
Yeah, right. Courage. And in Hebrew, you say ometz. And it's ometz. It's also related to adopting something. It's the same roots like adopting. So what do you need to adopt to be able to be more courageous? And in Spanish, I cannot remember. But I
Too
would
many
imagine
languages
it's a bit
at
like
once.
courage. But just
I think about the heart, the coeur.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
And that kind of gets to the heart of
Yeah.
the matter.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question from one of the panelists, one of the participants here. What do we do when the client says, "I don't know how I'm feeling"? Jenny, what do you? Natalie, go ahead.
I'll be glad to answer that because I get asked that question very often. I think first of all, sometimes it means that we're not used to be asked that question. So sometimes it helps to have different tools to help create that vocabulary, what we call emotional literacy. So it can be helpful to have cards with names, or we use sometimes the plastic flower, for example, to help develop that vocabulary. And sometimes some people that like more metaphors, it might be interesting to think about a metaphor about how you're feeling, or a color, or where do you feel it in your body. So that can be helpful. I like to use cards, so I always have some cards next to me for that, and that can be helpful. And it's also very often that we ask, how do you feel? And actually we get a thought. I feel that person is wrong, knowing it's a thought. So that's like, okay, so when you're feeling that, what are the actual feelings you're having? And Josh, usually you like to say, and I like that, is what else are you feeling? Because usually we're having, if it's a big thing or a complicated thing, we also might have big feelings or complicated feelings. So in having that, the plastic flower or cards or something like that, it can open different windows. And asking that question, also creating more vocabulary.
I'll put in a plug for next week's live stream. We're doing the live stream on ask us anything about emotions, and we're going to be sharing a new version of the plastic flower and a new emotion list for people who are interested. It's an interactive plastic model that we've been working with. Jenny, what advice would you?
I think if people answer any of our questions with "I don't know," we probably ask the wrong question. And I think there's a special, I don't know quite how to describe it. there's something about it. The question is often asked, how did that make you feel? When I'm training coaches, I advise them not to say that, because nobody can make you feel anything. But there's something about, sometimes clients will have a dread of being asked that question because they associate it with what they think of as the worst kind of therapy. Oh, somebody's going to ask, how do you feel? How do you feel? Tell me how you feel. So I think we have to be very careful about asking the question as bluntly as that. And maybe there are other ways of doing it. So if you notice the client has used a particular phrase with you, like I've felt that so-and-so was absolutely hopeless, or I felt it was hopeless, to just stay with hopeless and say, well, tell me more about hopeless. So you might get a better answer by saying, what does hopeless feel like? But of course, they have already named an emotion. It's more difficult if you just ask the how did it feel question just out of almost nothing. And I think that's where you get that I don't know question. The client is probably telling you, you're asking me that too soon.
And I think if they're giving you that I don't know, they've gone to a very logical place. And emotions are not logical all the time. You can't explain everything away. So if you get that I don't know, how can you take them to a less logical place and more of a place of, it's a little more abstract. But as Jenny said, how can you identify something that the client can go deep on, that can help them think through their word choices to help them get to the answer to the question. So it's taking them from the head to the heart, or recognizing where, it's an entire body sensory thing. It is head, it is heart, it is somatics, and helping them get out of their head sometimes when they say, I don't know, is part of the key.
I think I might be inclined with some kinds of clients who struggle to name emotion. And I really like the idea of cards, by the way, or lists of things that can help people who don't have a handy list of emotions. But I might say, if somebody's been describing something obviously very difficult and challenging, I might say, well, this is all sounding very objective, and I'm getting the feeling that you're describing it almost as if you're an outsider. What did it actually feel like at the time? So I'm just asking them then to go back to whatever the situation is. So how does it feel like right now? Or where in your body do you feel it? I mean, that sounds, of course, that's also you have to be careful how you ask that question too. So I comment on the objective thinking language, and encourage and point it out and say, that's the objective part, but tell me now about the feeling part. See what happens.
This brings me back to the emotion detective idea. And for me, when they've said earlier, everybody's telling me what to do. I had a client tell me that last week. And then later being able to come back and say, well, earlier you said everyone's telling you what to do. And when you said that, I heard that was kind of a charged thing for you. I haven't used the scary word feelings, right? That was a charged thing for you. Would you be willing to tell me more about that?
Yeah, that, Josh, is so important, that invitation, connecting to what Jenny, you were saying about if the client is saying, I don't know, maybe it's the wrong question, is, are we with the client or are we doing something to the client? If we're really with the client and we find a way to connect with the client using their language, and then asking this invitation of, do you want to dig deeper into that, into thoughts and feelings, then it's easier to connect that, whatever is the technique we use. But it's very different. We are with the client. We're the guide on the side. We're not just asking something to do something to the client.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have an interesting question here about culture. And I don't know, Natalie, whenever somebody talks about working across cultures, I just think of you. And how does it work for you? and for those who haven't met Natalie yet, Natalie grew up in Argentina and Israel and lived in France and married a Frenchman and lived in China. Sorry, I skipped and then married a Frenchman in China and now
the wrong order. I think that, and that's something really interesting also, because coaching is also a cultural, like a Western culture practice, let's say. So we have different ways of dealing with our own emotions. Culture is definitely has a major role in how we coach. I think that what's important to remember is that emotions are universal. Maybe not the way we express them, but we all feel them. So how to be aware of that? And I think it's different. It's a different challenge if I am from a different culture than the coachee is. I think if the coach and the coachee are in the same culture, it's definitely easier to make that connection. So understanding that we express it differently, and sometimes that means creating more trust, and being, as a coach, being more flexible into how emotions are going to be expressed. For example, what happens if, as a client, I am crying in the session? That might be less accepted in some cultures than others. So I need to be aware of that. And there is, of course, there's still like the generational issues, and the personality issues are also to need to be taken into account. So sometimes I don't want to say, oh, if you're coaching a Chinese person, it needs to be like this. Or if you're coaching a Japanese, because it's really not like that. You need to be aware of that. And I think it's part of creating that agreement with the client, understanding more about how they relate to their emotions, how they want to express their emotions, and also sharing a bit about ours. So I'm Argentinian, and my whole team is Chinese, and I always have my emotion here. Like, they always know how I feel when I'm training, when I'm coaching, when I'm, it's always there. And that also sometimes makes them feel uncomfortable. Sometimes they prefer I would hide them. And as a coach, I think that's also important, how I stay present and connected, and at the same time, I'm not overwhelming. And that goes back to the question that Fiorella was asking before. How do I become present in the coaching session? And then how do I ride the cultural wave in the session? And sometimes it happened to me before that because of cultural reasons, I didn't think the client is the right client for me. And I passed. I found the right coach for them.
Yeah.
Because I could feel they're feeling uncomfortable with me.
Jenny, let's go to you on this. And then Anne, I want to ask you about this question of culture and the new ICF competencies that I've been digging into.
Yep.
And so Jenny, emotions across cultures.
Well, I think I was listening to Natalie with absolute fascination. I'm really, coaching is so much in many ways a Western concept. And so there's the cultural, there's the national cultural thing, there's the class comes into it as well, education, as well as the individual makeup of the client. I think a lot depends on how far is the client willing to make themselves vulnerable with you. Because for coaching to work, they have to be able to do that. And I think in some cultures, having a coach might still be seen as more, as we would think of it, as having a mentor, somebody who gives you advice and who tells you what to do. And it's when I've worked with people who come from those kinds of cultures, they find it startling that that's not my role. And then there may be fear about losing face if you express vulnerability. So I think it's a very, very complicated question. And I think we have to go very, very carefully and respectfully.
I just want to bring this comment in from Nathaniel, which is also to think about this cross-cultural mix that most of us are living and working in, actually create some very interesting opportunities to acknowledge, oh, well, we might have some cultural differences about this. Now, in the new ICF competencies, and for those who are not familiar with this, the International Coaching Federation is shifting to a new set of 8 competencies. And There's a lot of similarity, but there's some significant changes. And someone in the chat earlier asked about about trust. And the first, I don't know, principle or subpoint in the new competencies about trust really relates to culture. And I'll just put it in the chat here, about understanding the client in their context. And what is your thought about this in terms of culture?
Can I do a quick reframe?
Please.
So the competencies, they are not new, they're updated. And you said it, they're very similar, but we're being really careful to say that we're not changing the entire the training methodology and what coaches need to know. It was a 2-year process talking to 1,300 coaches, and it was a team of 40 coaches from around the world that updated the competencies. And culture was very important. This was a very diverse, cross-cultural team who took an in-depth look at where we were, what translated, how we could simplify the language, and actually simplify the competencies. So we did go from 11 to 8. And they're much simpler. They're much more clear, and they do recognize different cultures and ways that people may interact. So there were things in there like dancing in the moment. Doesn't translate in a lot of cultures, and so the one I think, Josh, that you're talking about specifically is our shift from trust and intimacy to trust and safety. And there was a lot of conversation around that piece because intimacy is a very delicate word. It can mean so many different things. And what the intent of that specific competency was about was meeting your client where they're at with respect, without bias, without judgment, and being able to have the courage to create the space and hold the space so that you can deliver support, express empathy, and acknowledge your client's feelings and perceptions. And so it really wasn't about intimacy as at least we here in the US think about it. It was that universal need for safety.
Yeah, and getting into that universality. And that we're coming from different contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Josh, maybe to connect to that is really about trust. What Jenny was saying. So culture can become a barrier or it can become a bridge in the coaching. And in my case, if I am coaching a Chinese person, it's very clear I'm from a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
But if Anne is my coach or I am coaching Anne, we might look like we're from the same culture, but maybe we're not. So how we create trust with each other and in this process also understand how we are relating, what's our culture background, and how are we relating to going back to emotion, and that process of building trust, and whether we call it safety or intimacy, but how we do that in the coaching session has to do with how are we dealing with our own emotions and with the client emotions from the moment they come into the room.
And this new competency actually explicitly names emotions,
Yes.
Which is exciting. It says acknowledge and support the client's expression of feelings.
Yes.
And
we need to prepare. We need to have an emotional preparation for that.
Yes.
So
yeah.
We are not just coming into the room and starting a coaching session. That's also very exciting for me to see.
And talking about that reflective practice, that is something new that's in there. That is so important. So how are you preparing before and how are you decompressing after? So that reflective practice for yourself as a coach is just as important.
Jenny, this came up because of a question in the chat, which was about how do we build trust? And do you have any further thoughts about trust building? I'm sure you have a whole chapter about it.
Yeah, well, it's that's the first task you have to do. So it's all about contracting really carefully with the client, listening really carefully to what they say they want from you, asking all the time, what do you need from me on this, whatever the subject is, and being prepared to negotiate, listen really carefully and negotiate around it. And it all comes from there, really. I mean, I could go on and on about this for hours, but I think that's the essence of it, really. Asking what the client wants, listening to their story, and being prepared to know when it's genuinely is a coaching issue and when it's something else, and being prepared to say no if it's something else, or refer on if it is.
I'd like to talk a little bit about emotions and this concept of presence. And presence is one of those words that's very hard for some people to get their heads around. It's very easy to see it when it's there or not there, and I think feel it. So as we think about coaching presence and being present as a coach, what does that mean in terms of our own emotions and our clients' emotions? How do emotions help us or hinder us from being present?
Well, it's a really vague word, isn't it? It's a wonderful all-purpose word. And does it mean, for instance, being authentic? And if it means being authentic, what does being authentic mean as a coach? So your way of being authentic, Josh, would be probably very different from mine. But a client would spot if we were not being. I think for a lot of coaches, you do go on a kind of journey here. I think when you're a baby coach, you have to learn to keep yourself out of the way. In fact, you probably don't have very much presence. And that's probably quite a good thing, because you have to learn it's not, that thing, it's not about me. It's about the client. Then as you get more experienced, you realize you can bring yourself back into the conversation. Then the question is how? Which bits of yourself do you bring into the conversation? Not the mean, nasty, worried, anxious bit. That's for sure. But the warm, generous person, perhaps. But what form does that take with you? And I think that takes us back to the self-awareness thing. I think as you get more experience as a coach, you could compare a lot of people who've been coaching for a long time, and you might not see very much commonality in their presence, in their style. Some people would talk quite a lot. Some people would say very little. Some people might laugh a lot. Some people might be very serious. But it would probably work for their clients because they are being themselves. They do bring that unique presence. So I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks about this.
Well, when you were talking, I just went back to the earlier part of our conversation about something that's co-created or that's living between us in this process that we're both in. And I'm just reminded of, I used to think that empathy was something I gave to my client and that I had to build up in myself so I could give it to my client. And I sort of had this metaphor of it's like shining a light for them. And now I see it so differently. I feel it so differently. I feel that it's this light that's growing in this relationship. And I see myself in this light of like possibility and compassion. And I mean, it's just like, it's so moving to me to actually be able to see myself sometimes a little bit like that. But I think that maybe presence isn't mine. Maybe it's something that is growing. We're becoming more present together.
Well, I find an interesting connection between having presence and being present. So one is about the being of a coach, and the other one is about the doing of a coach. So I think as a coach, you want both of those things. You do want to have presence, and that's where the coaching mindset comes in. But then being present is is really where you get into the focus and the curiosity and managing emotions and the deep work of coaching. So when I think about presence, it really is, as Jenny said, kind of a broad word, and there are different ways to look at it.
I just bring in from our chat a couple of comments. Talking to an empty auditorium, there's no one present. And then Fiorella, I think this point about timing. You know what, Jenny, you said about sometimes you're pretty far and then maybe sometimes more present. Probably in a session or over a series of a coaching relationship, that's going to change depending on where the relationship is and what the client needs.
Yes, and doing that self-work. So for me, being present as a baby coach was just to really be here and not be in my head thinking about something else or connected to feelings, like especially now what Fiorella was saying before about being overwhelmed. And if I'm coming to a session where I am having all those emotions that I didn't navigate, so how can I be present, meaning being here, being connected, and being purposeful in creating that space together. And that is when dancing in the moment is coming in as well, even if it doesn't translate, right? But that leaving things open to really be the guide on the side with that person. And sometimes it looks a bit like a dance, and sometimes it's a bit more stuck, but still staying in that presence, staying there instead of becoming that judgmental voice of myself. For me, that's why compassion is helping me.
So sometimes it's as simple as, to pick up what you're saying, Natalie, it's preparing yourself properly for a session, making sure you have at least 15 minutes to read your notes, to get your, in the days when we didn't use Zoom and we were using the room, get the room ready. If you're doing it by Zoom, make sure that everything's ready and not being distracted. You've turned your phone off. There aren't children going to intrude, or noise from a fire alarm or whatever. And these very simple things, but just getting yourself in that space where you are ready to listen. And as you say, give your whole attention.
And as Jim says here, like shifting from where we were and what we were doing, being ready for this new, I think that transition process can take a while.
Yeah.
And Marilyn, I appreciate this, that if you're present, in a way, it's like being awake, like fully there, and that opens up creativity and passion and possibilities. Donna asks an important question I don't think we really have time for, but the super short answer is, the way I think about it is, therapy is about problems and the past, and coaching is about opportunities and the future. We could have a much deeper conversation about this, but that's my quick answer. And I do think it's important to know that if you're not a therapist, don't try to do therapy.
And Josh, maybe connected to this, I don't remember if it was you or Jenny that said earlier, Jenny, I think it was you, that if we're going to touch emotions, it shouldn't be coaching, it should be therapy. Some people make also that distinction, but actually we're not. We're saying we can talk about emotions and still be coaching. It's not because you talk about emotions, then automatically it becomes therapy, not at all.
Yeah.
Well,
this is a fear.
I think this is it is a huge topic, and maybe this should be the focus of one of your future conversations, Josh.
Are you volunteering to come back, Jenny?
It could run and run. My own view has changed quite a bit, and I now believe these boundaries are very blurred compared with how they used to be. And I've become very interested in the whole question of trauma and attachment in childhood, and attachment failures in childhood, which I think are extremely common. So I'm not thinking of trauma as people usually interpret it, as an event, but as the cumulative effect on our neurophysiology, which is very long lasting.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of coaching becomes very transactional because coaches are afraid to get into that territory because they think they're being asked to be trauma therapists. It's a huge topic. I think we need to understand much more about that if we want to do transformational coaching, and understand why ordinary coaching so often doesn't work, because people don't make those connections between the past and the present.
One of our coaches in the UK, her work is in education and in trauma-informed education, and recognizing that many students are coming into the room carrying trauma in their backpack.
Yes.
And I think that's also true for coaching. And coming back to what somebody brought up about the time that we're in, there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of complexity that people are experiencing right now and that we're experiencing right now. And
yeah, I think that we is important. I think the person who's affected me most here, a wonderful coach here in the UK called Julia Vaughan Smith, and she's written a book called Coaching and Trauma, which is the first attempt, I think, to seriously to investigate this territory. And she makes the point that coaches have trauma biographies too. It's not the case. There's an untraumatized population, which is us, the coaches, and a traumatized population, them, the poor old client. We're all affected in one way or another. And again, it goes back to this thing of knowing ourselves, knowing our own trauma history. Even if it's very, very mild, we will have one somewhere.
Well, we are out of time, so we have to schedule another one to continue this rich topic. And I'd love to just get a final comment from each of you. What's your parting thought or feeling? And
I love the thing about courage. I think that's been the theme that's gone through our conversation today. Have courage. Encourage clients to have courage. It's all about courage.
And honor your emotions, because it's part of the process and it is really important input.
I am really interested in continuing to understand more about how to have coaching conversations when I am not a formal coach, both as a mother and as a leader. And I'm taking a lot from today about, Jenny was saying, to ask, what do you need from me? And what happens if I'm asking that as a leader or as a mother? And then I can have a coaching conversation with somebody, even though they are not my formal coachee. So I am motivated to learn more about that and see what happens.
And there's so much richness in this today. I just want to go back to one comment that Jenny made about the myth of doing something. And I think I think a lot of men have this challenge with, when somebody tells us something, we think we're supposed to do something. And my wife will tell you, I still have not learned this. But I think it's an incredibly powerful realization that just somebody is expressing feelings. Maybe the most useful thing we can do is to say, thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or what do you need from me on this?
Yeah. And it sounds like you're having big feelings. The phrase I learned from Marilyn Jorgensen, who is here. It sounds like you're having big feelings. Thank you for sharing that. What do you need from me? What can I do to support you? So thank you, panelists. And I would ask you what you need from me and what I can do to support you, but I'll have to ask you that later. I'd love to continue the conversation, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Well, what a great, inspiring conversation. I think what I want to share in conclusion is one of the things I felt, since we're talking about emotions and coaching, I felt we were really having a coaching conversation among all the panelists. And what I noticed is the love for coaching. And like every one of you was so passionate, both the panelists and people in the chat. And you could really feel how that passion actually helps you be present, actually helps you transfer or like communicate your emotions to others. And I feel like there is so much more, and my mind is thinking about all these episodes we should do about coaching and all these different topics. But one of the questions I want to ask you that are watching and to put in the comments is, what do you think about what we talked today? What are the pieces that you think can apply to regular, normal conversations that are not coaching conversations? How much of this listening mindset, how much of these other competencies of presence can be applied to our normal conversations? So let us know. See you next week for another great episode about emotions again, where you get to ask all kinds of questions you always had in your head and wanted to share with us. Thank you.
If this was helpful, would you please comment, like, share, and subscribe? The Emotional Intelligence Network is your community to grow and practice EQ. At 6 seconds, that means being smarter with feelings. And we're here to provide practical, proven EQ tools so workplaces, schools, and people can thrive everywhere in the world. Be sure to visit 6seconds.org to find the complete suite of resources, assessments, and programs. Thank you for watching.